So this is my Keith McElveen video. I wanted to start with an anecdote from when I used to work at the Public Defender Agency. One of the attorneys I worked with when I first started working there was a guy named Rob Meacham. He's a really interesting guy. And he worked on a billion criminal cases, and for many years he was the child in need of aid attorney at the Public Defender Agency. So he represented parents who were having their kids taken away by the state. But he had also represented criminal defendants in the area for decades, so he saw the same people sort of moving through the system for decades. Anyway, one of the things that he talked about when it came to representing people in very serious cases was just how they came off, how they appeared to the jury. Those soft factors might not seem like they're that big of a deal, but intangible things like how somebody looks, like if they look like dishonest, thing sort of, I think, shades the way that juries and judges deal with people a lot more than we would like to admit. But anyway, Rob had a saying that he used to talk about, which is felony eyes, and it's just you kind of just know it when you see it type deal, one of those type things when you've worked in a lot of criminal cases. I think anybody that's worked at the Public Defender understands that this concept is that there's just some defendants who have like a million-mile stare, and they just looks like nobody's home, behind the wheel. And those are the defendants that end up getting convicted of felonies, end up doing time, is because I think there's something that people have in their ability to sort of judge other people's capacity, and I think there's just something sort of hardwired into people where you can detect that somebody might, be a real problem. Felony eyes. So anyway, one of the things that I think is interesting about this case is that Charlie Adelson, despite being a wealthy defendant with a lot of advantages, he also has felony eyes, especially in his trial. He looks better in some of his older pictures, but he really has dark bags in his eyes by the time he gets to trial, and he does himself no favors with his tics. You can just tell there's a lot of nervous energy bubbling, and his eyes are always sort of squinting, and for some reason he reminds me of Richard Nixon. He just has that sort of flop sweat. He always sort of looks a little bit greasy, and so the effect combined of him and Rashbaum is just quite the duo. When I look at Rashbaum, he's like literally crooked. Like his face is like pointed in two different directions, like some weird Picasso profile or something. He's just very unnerving, the two of them together. The reason I'm sort of thinking about this front of mind is because right in the beginning of the Keith McElveen testimony, there's some really amazing shots of Charlie and Daniel Rashbaum as the jury's coming in. That's sort of another one of these things that you might not think about if you haven't been involved in a few jury trials, is that like when the jury comes into the room and everybody's sort of standing up and then sitting down, the jury's been sitting there for days at this point, so they're bored, and so they kind of just have patterns where when they first get into the room, they're sort of surveying everybody, and it's just interesting because the camera lingers on Charlie, and you can see him as the jury would see him, as he's sort of standing up and then sitting down, because it's also one of the rare times the jury gets to actually see the defendant standing up, because usually the jury enters the room last, so the defendant's not often walking to a seat or moving around when the jury's in the room. So the jury's, more likely to be looking at Charlie, is my point, when he's standing up and then sitting down, and you can just see him sitting there being nervous, squinting, and then you have Daniel Rashbaum sitting there sniffing on his fingers, which reminds me of another lolcow named Wings of Redemption. I don't know how deep the rest of you are in terms of internet stuff, but yeah, Wings of Redemption is another finger sniffer who's a interesting rabbit hole if you want to go down that one. He's a 500-pound redneck who makes a living streaming video games. Fun guy. Anyway, so I just wanted to go over what I saw when I watched the Keith McElveen testimony during Charlie Adelson's trial. I just thought there was a few interesting things with the way that he testified as a witness and some of the things that he had to say about the audio that he cut up. Keith McElveen is the guy that enhanced the Dolce Vita and the Matsuri audio, the audio where Charlie is talking to Katie at the restaurant and, basically makes a bunch of very incriminating statements. So, yeah, this, if you don't, just to give you like a brief summary of what this audio is, probably the best way to talk about this is to mention that Georgia Kappelman discussed Keith McElveen and his contributions to the case when she was on Surviving the Survivor. So I'll play a clip here where Georgia summarizes really well the process that her office went through in trying to find an expert to clean up the audio.
So that exhibit traveled through the hands of several different experts before it got to Mr. McElveen, who ultimately was able to produce the product we published in court. I do know that there were some advancements in technology that assisted Mr. McElveen in ultimately producing the better result. But I think also we just largely finally found the right person for the job. This guy, I think his credentials were a little bit understated in trial because, I don't know, maybe if he says it, he'll have to kill us or something. But I mean, he was very highly regarded by the federal government, worked on anti-terrorism type of stuff, and just really seemed to be the best man for the job.
So yeah, I thought that this was one of the best answers that came out of this interview on Surviving the Survivor. I wish that a more serious show would have interviewed Georgia, or that she had done more media stuff, because she has some really fascinating tidbits, like this tidbit about how she ended up finding Keith McElveen to clean up the audio. But so much of this interview that she was on with Surviving the Survivor was really fluff, I thought, which is unfortunate. Surviving the Survivor does have some really great guests on the show, but one of the things that really bugs me is that they have intros that just go on forever, and I don't really like intros in general. I wish that there were a lot less of them on podcasts and stuff, but it really just goes above and beyond on Surviving the Survivor. What I usually do if I end up watching their stuff is I usually skip like 5 or 10 minutes into the video after just sort of scrubbing through it, just to sort of get like the guest's first answer to a question, because like everything before that to me is like very difficult to listen to. I was just sort of looking at just like the first 10 minutes of this Georgia Kapelman interview as an example, because I think this is fairly typical of a lot of their videos. Some of them might even, have a lot longer intros than this, but on this interview with Georgia Kapelman, which is a very rare media appearance for her, we don't even see Georgia Kapelman on screen in the interview until 4 minutes and 20 seconds into it. That's pretty wild if you think about that. 4 minutes and 20 seconds of an intro. And some of it's like canned stuff, like the same thing that they play at the beginning of every show, where they have like little bumper segments or whatever that are 30 seconds long. I would skip that for this interview, But anyway, finally, after 4 minutes and 20 seconds, we see Georgia Kapelman, but even then they still have to go through another intro after the intro where Joel reads Georgia's credits, and that takes 30 seconds. And so we don't hear from Georgia until 4 minutes and 50 seconds into the interview, and that's Joel asking her, "How are you?" and her responding, "Fine," and then him asking her if they should call her Georgia or Ms. Kapelman. And then we don't get our first actual question posed to Georgia until 6 minutes and 45 seconds into the interview. And the question is, how does the Markel case stack up for you? I mean, I just hate those kind of questions because they're, I guess, technically open-ended, but they just are not. They just sort of suggest the answer, and it's just not a question that puts your guest in a good position to answer something interesting. And it's also a question that focuses on Georgia, where I get the impression that she's sort of more interested in talking about the case or the victims or something. I think prosecutors are pretty typically like not somebody that like wants a lot of attention on them. They are in a job where that's pretty thankless, and it's just something that it's just a question that I don't think is very well suited for Georgia. So then we get an answer from Georgia where she talks for about 30 seconds. And then immediately after Georgia finishes her answer, we get a tick from Joel where he says, "Speaking of blah, 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 blah." It's just one of those things where he has like a lot of those sort of broadcaster ticks that I'm sure are very hard to unlearn, but it's like he has a lot of canned segues. The second question is he reads a comment from one of the listeners complimenting Georgia's shoes. And this question takes over a minute to ask. It's about 1 minute and 10 seconds. And then the second actual question is at 8 minutes and 20 seconds, and it's how are you so composed? And then we get an answer from Georgia that's about a little under 20 seconds. And then at 8 minutes and 37 seconds, we have a meandering question from Carm, where she sort of diagnoses Georgia's personality type. And the question is, it's really interesting when you actually type these out and see what they're actually asking, because it's even more insane when you look at it on paper. I mean, it's in the moment, it seems pretty nuts, but when you actually just like see it in black and white, it's like, holy shit. So Carm's question at 8:37 eventually is, are you a histrionic personality? Or something along those lines. And that question ends at 9 minutes and 3 seconds. So that's, almost 30-second long question. And Georgia Kappelman has like a one-word answer in response, basically no. And then at 9:05 we get a segment of Joel and Carm bantering, where Carm is sort of again diagnosing Georgia and comparing her temperament and Georgia's temperament, Carm and Georgia's temperament. So that goes on for about 35 seconds until we get a Joel Waldman question that is like just so perfect and typical that I just had to sort of end my bitch sesh about STS right here, because I think does a pretty good job of demonstrating what I think is something that he could clean up as an interviewer. That's just my trying to be constructive with my criticism here. But at 9:40, Joel asks this question: what's your process, and how does exacting justice motivate you? I'm summarizing here a lot, but in essence, those are the two questions that he asks her. I mentioned this earlier, but these are two questions that are both not great questions on their own, because again, they sort of suggest an answer in that they're definitely, I guess in some sense they are open-ended, but they're like leading you down a cul-de-sac to a very boring answer. They suggest the answer inside of the question. They're sort of almost rhetorical. It's almost like a lawyer on direct just asking you like a yes or no question to sort of put their words in your mouth. It's really annoying, and it's two totally different questions. I mean, that sort of needs to be emphasized. Again, what's your process for being a lawyer? How do you research cases and stuff like that? And so I'm assuming he's asking. And then how does exacting justice motivate you? I mean, those are two sort of like maybe interrelated on some level, but two totally different questions. And what it reminded me of is like almost like an even more amateurish Larry King type question, where it's like, he's sort of out of context, like, how do you do what you do? Like, where do you get your ideas from? Those type of like kind of insane zero context questions. But it's even more meandering than the typical Larry King type question, and it's also two questions in one. So it's like doubly awful. So, okay, here are my thoughts on the Keith McElveen testimony. I thought this was really interesting, and I wanted to put out something on it because I just noticed there wasn't a lot of other discussion about it on YouTube. I didn't see any other videos breaking it down. So I watched it, and I thought it was a pretty interesting testimony, even though it's short. But it lays the foundation for how those two recordings came in, the Matsuri audio and the Dolce Vita audio. Keith McElveen is an expert in cleaning up audio, and he's worked for the federal government and pretty impressive client list before. So I'll provide a link to the whole YouTube video for this, where I found this testimony. It was in a Law and Crime Network video that I'm excerpting the testimony from. I'll also include timestamps for my notes in the description of this video if you want to jump around. Testimony for Keith McElveen starts at around 5 hours and 10 minutes in. It's day 4 of the trial video, so the whole video is about 8 hours and 19 minutes long. And so Keith McElveen's testimony starts at about 5 hours and 10 minutes into the video. So it's one thing that's important to note, just for context, is that Keith was only asked to clean up this audio recently. In the beginning, in January 2022 is when he was hired. This audio didn't exist for the previous trials of Sigfredo Garcia and Catherine McBanawa. So this has only been part of the latest trial, Charlie Adelson's trial. Georgia leads Keith through his credentials, and Daniel Rashbaum doesn't attempt to challenge him, so he's introduced as an expert in the case. In the direct examination with Georgia, it's explained that he cleaned up the Dolce Vita recording and the Matsura recording. And he explains that the way that he cleaned up the Dolce Vita recording is that there was 2 different audio recorders that were present recording that conversation between Charlie and Katie at the Dolce Vita restaurant. One of the recordings had better video but worse audio, and the other recording was the opposite. It had bad video but good audio. And so that's the one that he mostly worked with, is the one that had good audio. It's the one that the camera was filming through like a mesh screen, so the video wasn't very good, but it had better audio than the other version. And it was interesting hearing Keith explain the technique that his company uses to clean up audio. He's only started describing it in like broad strokes, but he says that they basically treat audio like you'd treat like a photograph or a video file, where it's you get something and it's blurry and you want to use the computer program to make it sharper. And so that's kind of what they do, sort of within that image. If you could visually map a sound, people's voices would be like mapped onto that image where they are located within the sort of soundscape, right? So if you have Charlie and Katie speaking inside a crowded restaurant, there's all sorts of little sound waves popping up from all sorts of different sources. You have clattering dishes, you have other conversations going on. So if you just consider like the actual image of the soundscape to be like just like a floor plan of what the restaurant looks like, a big square restaurant room, or however it was arranged. The idea was that Keith McElveen's company would clean up that audio by sort of sharpening the focus on where in the recording the voices of Charlie and Katie were. So they would sharpen that area of the audio and blur out the rest of the non-relevant portions of the audio. Hopefully that makes sense. So at 5 hours and 12 minutes in, Georgia asks Keith how the audio was when he got it. So this was like the raw audio version that they had. And this is also interesting hearing the way that Keith described the audio that he received and all the problems with it. He described it as a mess. If you think about it, there's so much going on in that audio recording inside Dolce Vita. I mean, a restaurant's probably like the worst place you could think of to try to capture sound, outside of like maybe like a heating duct or something like that. I mean, it's tough because there's all sorts of different noises, competing conversations, and so Keith walks her through all the other challenges that they had. And one of the things that he points out that I hadn't thought about was that these devices that were recording the conversations moved a number of times. So one of the undercover agents moved one of the recording device that had the best audio from outside to inside, right? So that's two completely different audio environments, going from outside and cars going by, all that sort of noise, to inside a restaurant, totally different, but again in lots of different sounds going on inside the restaurant. And so then the person with the recorders then at the counter, presumably waiting for a seat to open up, and then they go to one seat and end up moving again to get a better spot. So they move 2 different tables in the restaurant. So there's, if you think about it, at least 4 different distinct audio environments that they had to clean up. And what Keith describes is that they basically broke the audio down into different chunks so that it was sort of segregated by the different audio environments, like outside the restaurant, inside the restaurant at the counter, inside the restaurant at seat 1, and then inside the restaurant at seat 2 was how I took it. There's about 4 different main environments of audio. The other thing that was interesting that Keith talked about is how the positioning of the bags were like not ideal at all. And it just got me thinking about how complicated it is to capture good audio even in the best of circumstances. Like right now, as I'm talking into this microphone, there's probably like a million things I could be doing to make it slightly better, like putting foam on the walls or God knows what else. I mean, it's difficult to get good audio even while I'm sitting here on a couch in the best of circumstances. But consider that not only were they in a bad restaurant, but the agents who were recording the undercover conversation weren't trained in like the best places to set your recorder to capture good audio. So it was in places that were not ideal and sort of muffled by different things. There's objects in between the undercover bag with the recorder and where the subjects were having the conversation they wanted to record. So there's a lot of different challenges besides it just being in a noisy restaurant. There's all the different environments in the restaurant, and there's also really not ideal positioning of the recorders. 5 hours, 14 minutes, State's Exhibit 110 is entered over objection. That's the thumb drive with the Dolce Vita recording. Then at 5 hours, 15 minutes, Georgia asks Keith if, they can change words, if they can insert words. Just basically asking Keith to explain to the jury that no, they can't insert made-up conversations into the recording. And of course, Keith says no, they don't do that. They just run the program and it runs straight through the recording and cleans up what it can clean up. So then at 5 hours, 15 minutes, 30 seconds, the Matsuri recording states 113 is entered into evidence, no objection. At 5 hours, 16 minutes, we get the start of Rashbaum's cross. One of the reasons why I think this is interesting to look at is it shows how important it is to be economical with witnesses, especially as a defense attorney. Unless you have like a really important point to make in confronting a witness, I would always err on the side of not entering into cross. And especially not a lengthy cross, this one's not that bad. I think it's about 10 minutes or so. If you think about like Rashbaum trying to advance the ball with every play, in this one it was like a fumble where he lost 10 yards. And now on second down, you're like second and 25 and, looking to punt. So yeah, it was like Rashbaum almost did a better direct on cross than because he got Keith to go into a little bit more detail about how the technology worked. I think he only sort of bolstered Keith's credibility is my main point. And you can only piss off the jury by drawing things out. So this was, meant to be a pretty quick foundational thing, just sort of explaining that the audio got cleaned up. And I think that's one of these things that's self-evident. And when you fight tooth and nail on these points, the jury just really doesn't see you as credible, especially later on when there's, a lot bigger points where your credibility is going to be weighed. So at 5 hours, 16 minutes, we get the beginning of the cross, as I said. The first question is he gets Keith to admit that, Keith doesn't know when the recording was made. So, that's true. It's not something that Keith would be concerned with, obviously. He's just cleaning it up. He's not authenticating its date or anything like that. I mean, I could see maybe asking that one question since he's up there anyway. It's just going to take a second and you just want to put it in the front of the jury's mind that, hey, this guy only, his knowledge of the recording is not, is only for a very limited purpose for cleaning up the audio. So, there may be, the guy's not an expert in this case, I guess. I don't know. I'm struggling to even explain the point of what that question is. And then the next question is Rashbaum asks him when he was hired for the case, January 2022. So, I guess maybe Rashbaum's trying to say, well, he hasn't been familiar with this case for that long, which I don't know. And that's one of the things that, as Georgia mentioned in the Surviving the Survivor interview, is that it did take her a while to find Keith. And, it basically, to me, all this shows is that Keith's a really great expert. He was hard to find. He was in demand. And he was somebody that took a lot of digging to get to him because the other more available engineers weren't any good. So, that's what I think Rashbaum is underlying when he asks him these questions to the jury. It's just, if it cuts both ways at all, it just basically shows that he's in demand. Okay, and so then, and this is also one of the things that besides the fact that Rashbaum doesn't get anywhere with this, and that it's a good example of why it's not good to waste the jury's time with cross if you don't have a great reason to. This also shows an interesting gulf between two different mindsets, where on the one hand you have Daniel Rashbaum, the weasel word lawyer, who's all about technicalities and spinning stuff. And then on the other side you have Keith McElveen, who is an engineer all the way through. It's having a conversation with a computer almost. He's a very logical guy. And so there's a number of examples in this conversation that I want to point out where you can see Keith's wheels churning as he's getting these questions from Rashbaum that are just so disingenuous, and Keith just sort of knocks them all down just blows through Rashbaum's flimsy premises, and it's fun to watch. So I wanted to point a few of those out. So the first one of those questions where Rashbaum tries to get Keith to agree with his straw man premise is at 5 hours 16 minutes 40 seconds. Rashbaum asks Keith if he'd agree with him that there's 20 minutes of the recording missing, and Keith looks sort of puzzled and he asks him to clarify. It's like, does not compute. What do you mean by missing? And I'm still not even really sure what he means by missing. I mean, I think what Rashbaum's trying to point out is that these two people were having a conversation before the recording started, and it's possible that the recording didn't pick up the beginning of their conversation. That's I think essentially what he's trying to point out, but I don't know, it's just really odd that he would frame it as like there's 20 minutes missing. I mean, maybe that's like the amount of time that Charlie and Katie had been seated at the table before the recording started. They somehow reconstructed that, but I mean, it's just it's just not something that I don't think that Keith would agree with the framing of that at all. It sort of assumes a bunch of stuff that hasn't been covered yet, assumes some facts that aren't in evidence, and so Keith is like, what do you mean by that? You can just tell he's like, I'm not sure where you're getting that figure from. So he basically says, I'm not sure, can you clarify in the middle of which conversation? Do you mean the middle segment of the conversations? Because in Keith's mind, he's already acknowledged, during direct and during cross, that he doesn't know what was going on before the beginning of the recording. They could have been having some other conversation before the recording started. He's acknowledged that. But Rashbaum's trying to ask him, trying to muddy up like what the middle of the conversation was, or like what is this 20 minutes that's supposedly missing. And so to Keith, this must be coming off as like a total non sequitur, and so it doesn't make sense. So he's trying to sort of reorient Rashbaum to like something that Keith does understand. And so he says like, hey dummy, like, is this what you're asking about, like the middle section of the different sections that we cleaned up? Is that what you're asking about? Because otherwise this doesn't make sense. So then at 5 hours, 17 minutes, 40 seconds, this is really, again, fascinating to me. So then at 5 hours, 17 minutes, 43 seconds, Rashbaum asks, the recording of the conversation you enhanced is not the beginning of the conversation, correct? Then we have Keith say, again, I don't know when they began talking, but on our end, we cleaned up, all these different segments, as I previously explained. So it's like he's answered this question, I think, 2 or 3 times now. And Rashbaum keeps trying to sort of reword it and triangulate, but Keith just isn't taking the bait, isn't getting annoyed. He's just explaining carefully, very precisely what he means. So then at 5 hours, 18 minutes, 36 seconds, we get the same question essentially again from Rashbaum. But you don't know if the conversation began before the recording started, correct? So is this the 3rd or the 4th time he's been asked this same question? And the other thing that, again, this isn't something that you really even need pointed out to you. Like if the jury's going to hear the recording, right? So they know that like it seems like it sort of, the jury should be able to tell if it seems like it picked up in the middle of the conversation. They don't need this pointed out to them, hammered over the head like 3 or 4 times in a cross. So this is only pissing the jury off, I guarantee you. So yeah, and again, Keith calmly responds and says, got it, thank you, drive through. And so then a few seconds later, we get another question from Rashbaum. And this time he's asking about, even on the enhanced version, virtually everything the female participant says is inaudible, right? So this is, I want you to pay attention to, there's always the weasel word that Rashbaum is using, virtually. Even on the enhanced version, virtually everything female participant said is inaudible, right? And Keith immediately catches on to what Rashbaum's trying to do here, and he says, I'm not sure what you mean by virtually. You can tell he's like, it's a real weasel word. But another thing I think that Keith does that's really good as a witness is he doesn't get caught up into this like tit for tat game where he's going to say, well, he's just going to reply, well, I don't know what you mean by virtually, and then sort of appear a little bit recalcitrant to the jury. Instead, Keith answers, I'm not sure what you mean by virtually, so he makes sure to make that point, but he says, in general, the female did speak a lot less during the recording, and so he points out like that more of her words are audible during the first segment than the middle segment, in position 1 in the restaurant where they're recording from maybe the counter versus position 2 where they're recording at a seat. So maybe like, more of her words are audible in one recording than another, but she also seemed to speak less in the middle segment. So it just gives Keith a chance to sort of explain the finer details of like what was able to be picked up with Catherine McManus' voice. So then at 5 hours, 19 minutes, 46 seconds, Keith also acknowledges that his technology couldn't make out some of McBano's words because she was so quiet. And so, this again just gives Keith an opportunity to explain in a little bit more detail, what the technology can and can't do. And so I think, again, that only bolsters the credibility because Keith's not claiming some incredible claim about what this technology can do. It has limitations, and he's explaining those to you. And so I think the reason why Rashbaum might be sort of harping on this so much is because it's basically the only fig leaf that he has to try and find, wedge some place where that second layer of extortion comes in. Because those few inaudible words on the tape are like basically he's banking on being able to turn, a few things that Katie said that you can't hear on the tape into some sort of second layer of extortion that wasn't picked up conveniently on the recording. And this impression of mine, I think, isn't unfair because Charlie, during his testimony, made that ridiculous statement where he whispered to his father about extortion on the other enhanced undercover tape, the Metsuru recording. So, it's not like it's a very far-out argument when Charlie's essentially making that same sort of argument based on the other enhanced recording. Keith also points out that Catherine McBano's voice was so low in the restaurant that Charlie himself had to ask her a few times to speak up. And so this just adds, to me, it really sort of, again, if nothing else, damaged Rashbaum's escape route where he now has to come over like another hurdle. Instead of just like trying to imply to the jury that, well, maybe there's some stuff that you couldn't hear on this tape that Catherine said. Now we know that, like, we emphasize that Charlie was having to ask Catherine McBano to speak up. So she goes to show that she has these behavioral cues where she's being sort of very passive and Charlie's the one doing all the talking. And this is just something that kind of gets emphasized again and again the more that you dwell on this undercover tape at Dolce Vita. It's very damaging evidence. So I think you'd kind of just want to like move along on to the next thing. You don't want to linger on this because it's terrible for your client. And the more that we plumb the depths of it, the more we're going to define that's not good for your client. If you're trying to say that there's some sort of hidden conversation in the Dolce Vita tape where Katie was whisper blackmailing Charlie on one layer of the plot, but then accepting money and cars and all sorts of other stuff with every imaginable paper trail tying Katie to the Adelsons on the other, it's just impossible to buy. That's what it is. And one thing I've thought about a lot while watching this testimony is how Katie's very lucky that she didn't end up as lunch meat because she was very rapidly becoming a loose end for Charlie and the Adelsons. So at 5 hours and 20 minutes in, Rashbaum tries to make the point that Keith could only clean up half the conversation on the Dolce Vita tape, but Keith is such a precise and perceptive witness that he immediately again calls Rashbaum on his BS, and he's like, no, it wasn't half the conversation that we couldn't clean up. It was one side of a conversation. Really interesting that Keith McElveen picked up on that because one side is different than one half because Charlie in that conversation, like usual, was doing most of the talking. And Charlie was a lot easier to clean up in the mix than Catherine McBano because Catherine was very passive and was mostly listening, quieter and speaking in a different direction than Charlie. So she was just different in the mix. She was a passive participant in the conversation like she was in the plot in general. She was a conduit. So, and the other thing that Keith pointed out is that what Katie was saying in the conversation could mostly be inferred because, as Keith pointed out, Charlie was responding to what Katie was saying. And so it was almost immaterial what Katie actually said in a lot of the conversation because Charlie was the one doing all the talking. And so again, it just showed me that Rashbaum wasn't very tactically sound to try to go down that area when it wasn't helpful to his client at all. If anything, it was hurtful. And so then again, Rashbaum tries to go into another area at 5 hours, 20 minutes, and 14 seconds. Rashbaum tries to get Keith to talk about his recording versus the FBI's recording and asks him whether or not Keith was aware that the FBI tried to do an enhancement in 2016. Asks Keith about comparing those two enhancements, the FBI's 2016 enhancement and Keith's enhancement from 2022. And again, Rashbaum tries to introduce the weasel word virtually and asks him, can't you hear virtually everything you can hear on the FBI enhancement that you can hear on your enhancement? And then Keith again pauses, seems puzzled by this strange little man before him. This little strange crooked man. It's hard to describe Rashbaum as anything but just like an odd little guy. And Keith doesn't buy what Rashbaum's saying again. He says he doesn't agree with that statement. Keith, doesn't want to toot his own horn, but he says, it's much clearer on my enhancement, and my understanding is that the older versions weren't suitable. Georgia didn't think that they were good enough, and that's why I was hired. So it gives Keith an opportunity to better explain what his technology did and why he was brought in, because he was better than the FBI. So it's just again bolstered Keith and made Rashbaum look dumb for wasting the time. Then at 5 hours, 21 minutes, 46 seconds, Rashbaum moves on to the Matsuri tape. He got nowhere with his Dolce Vita question. If anything, he's totally backslid. But then, we get a short series of questions on Matsuri. He's basically trying to somehow insinuate that they could have inserted different words or gotten different words out of it, which, it was already covered during direct, and it just makes Rashbaum look slimy, trying to imply that this engineer guy was going to somehow doctor the tape to implicate. I don't know. I don't even know what he's trying to imply. But there's another good example of a good answer by Keith at 5 hours, 22 minutes, 16 seconds, where Rashbaum's trying to ask Keith if he can hear different words. Again, trying to imply something nefarious about the enhancement. And Keith, again, just graciously goes along with Rashbaum's disingenuous strawman framing and says, "Sure, I think you can hear some different new words in my clearer version." And Keith's essentially saying, again, different is a Weasley way to say it, but yes, you can hear some words in my enhancement that weren't previously audible. How about that, you little muffin-headed freak? And then at 5 hours, 22 minutes, 40 seconds, Rashbaum tries to plant some seed that there was like a whispered into ear convo that wasn't recoverable on the enhancement. And again, Keith's like, sure, I guess, if you're, in that where they're whispering into each other's ears, he gives like a scientific explanation about how one head gets in the way of the recorder, even more so in that scenario. So yeah, it's not great environment to record the audio. Again, there's a couple things I wanted to point out that I saw in that interview, and I'm just getting into making videos and stuff specifically for YouTube. I also have a Substack that I've been posting stuff. So anyway, I have links in my description along with the timestamps, and thanks for stopping by.